Sarah Davenport adjusted her glasses as she carefully examined the newly acquired daguerreotype under the specialized light in the conservation lab of the San Francisco Historical Society Museum. At 34, she was the youngest senior curator in the museum's history, specializing in 19th century photography. This particular image had arrived last week as part of the Beckford collection, belongings of a prominent Gold Rush-era family donated by a distant descendant. "There's something odd about this one," she murmured to her colleague, Marcus Chen, who leaned over her shoulder. The photograph, dated 1857, showed two children, a boy around 10 and a girl perhaps 7, posed stiffly in formal attire typical of the period. Their solemn faces stared out from beneath the daguerreotype's tarnished surface, the silver plate catching the light as Sarah tilted it slightly. "Standard Victorian portrait," Marcus replied. "Creepy, but they all are from that era. Children had to sit still for so long that they looked like tiny adults." Sarah wasn't convinced. "Help me get this digitized at the highest resolution. There's something in the background I want to check." Later that afternoon, Sarah sat alone in her office, the museum quiet as closing time approached. Rain pattered against the windows of the converted Victorian mansion that housed the Historical Society in Pacific Heights. The digital scan of the daguerreotype filled her computer screen as she zoomed in on the darkened area behind the children. Her breath caught. There, almost invisible in the shadowed background, were what appeared to be hands, adult hands, resting on the children's shoulders. But the children were positioned alone, according to the formal composition. There should be no one behind them. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered, zooming further until the pixelation made the image unclear. She saved the file and quickly searched the donation records for more information about the Beckford family. The results were sparse. Jonathan and Elizabeth Beckford, prominent in San Francisco society during the 1850s, had two children, William and Catherine. The family had lived in a mansion in Nob Hill, now long demolished. Jonathan had made his fortune in shipping and banking before his sudden death in 1858. Elizabeth and the children had disappeared from public record shortly after. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Found something in the archives about your Beckford photo. You should see this." Her stomach tightened with anticipation as she gathered her things. The rain had intensified, drumming against the windows and obscuring the view of the bay. For a moment Sarah thought she saw a handprint appear on the foggy glass, but when she blinked, it was gone. Just her imagination, surely. But as she hurried down the ornate staircase of the museum, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched by eyes as lifeless and penetrating as those of the Beckford children, staring out from across more than 160 years of history. The basement archives of the San Francisco Historical Society smelled of old paper and chemical preservatives. Sarah found Marcus hunched over a leather-bound ledger, his face illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lighting that had replaced the original gas lamps decades ago. "Look at this," he said without preamble, pointing to an entry dated November 18th, 1858. "It's from the police records we digitized last year." Sarah read the faded handwriting, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's perpetual coolness. Investigation into the deaths of Jonathan Beckford, 45, and household staff member Harold Meyer, 27, remains inconclusive. Mrs. Elizabeth Beckford insists the deaths were accidents resulting from falls. Children report nothing unusual. Case suspended pending further evidence. 2 deaths in the same household, ruled as accidents. Sarah frowned. "That seems convenient." Marcus nodded. "Keep reading." Sarah turned the page to find a follow-up entry from December 1858. Mrs. Elizabeth Beckford and children William, 10, and Catherine, 7, departed for family estate in Massachusetts, mansion to be sold. Several staff report unusual disturbances in house following deaths. Claims dismissed as superstition. "Disturbances," Sarah repeated. "What kind of disturbances?" "I found a personal account from one of the maids." Marcus said, sliding over a fragile diary. She claimed to have seen hands emerging from walls and heard children's laughter when the Beckford children were absent from the house. Sarah's mind returned to the photograph, to those strange, ghostly hands. This is fascinating from a historical perspective, but it doesn't explain the anomaly in the photograph. There must be a rational explanation. Of course, Marcus agreed, though he looked unconvinced. Photography from that era had all kinds of imperfections, double exposures, movement artifacts. "See, the hands are too deliberate for that," Sarah argued. "And look at this." She opened her laptop and showed him the enhanced image. The hands were clearly adult-sized, one resting on each child's shoulder. But what she hadn't noticed before was that the sleeves visible above the hands didn't match any clothing worn by the children or anyone else visible in the portrait. "These belong to someone standing behind them," she said. "Someone who should be visible but isn't." Marcus whistled softly. "That's bizarre. Do you think someone was edited out of the original? In 1857? The techniques wouldn't have been sophisticated enough to do this cleanly." Sarah closed her laptop. "I want to check if we have any other Beckford family materials in the collection." Well, they spent the next hour combing through the recently donated boxes. Most contained typical upper-class Victorian items, ledgers, correspondence about business matters, a few pieces of jewellery, and several more photographs, but none with the same children. At the bottom of the final box, Sarah found a small journal bound in faded red leather. The first page identified it as belonging to Catherine Beckford, with childish handwriting detailing daily life in 1858. As Sarah carefully turned the delicate pages, her unease grew. Catherine wrote of a shadow man who visited her room at night, whom her parents couldn't see. The entries became increasingly distressed until abruptly ending in November 1858, the month her father died. The final entry simply read, "He says he will take us all away soon. William says not to be afraid, but I can see his hands coming through the walls again tonight." Sarah closed the journal, her professional skepticism battling with the undeniable chill the words had sent through her. "We need to research what happened to the family after they left San Francisco." Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against the small basement windows. For a moment, both Sarah and Marcus froze as what looked like finger marks dragged slowly down the glass, leaving trails in the condensation. When they looked again, there was nothing but raindrops. Morning brought clearer skies over San Francisco, but Sarah's mind remained clouded with questions about the Beckford photograph. She'd spent half the night researching, finding only that Elizabeth Beckford had died in Massachusetts in 1860, with no mention of the children's fate. By 9 a.m., she was at the desk of Dr. Elena Vasquez, the museum's photography expert and resident historian on early San Francisco. "Fascinating," Elena said, examining the digital scan. "The photographer's mark is J.W. Carlton. He was quite prominent in the 1850s, known for portraits of wealthy families. His studio was on Montgomery Street." "What do you make of the anomaly?" Sarah asked, pointing to the mysterious hands. Elena frowned. "In 20 years of studying daguerreotypes, I've never seen anything like it. It's not a double exposure. The hands are too precisely positioned." She looked up at Sarah. "Carlton himself died under strange circumstances in 1859, actually. He was found in his darkroom, apparently having suffered some kind of seizure. His assistant claimed he'd been working on Beckford family portraits just before his death." Sarah felt her skin prickle. "Is there any record of what happened to his work?" "Most was sold off or claimed by clients, but—" Elena tapped at her computer. "The Historical Society might have some of his business records. They were donated in the 1920s. An hour later, Sarah was poring over Carlton's appointment book. There it was, multiple sessions with the Beckford family throughout 1857 and 1858, the last one just days before Jonathan Beckford's death. A loose page fell from the book. A letter written in a shaky hand, dated the day before Carlton's death. I can no longer distinguish between what is real and what I have glimpsed through my lens. The Beckford portraits have shown me things no human should see. I believe whatever was in that house has followed me. The children's eyes follow me around the room, and last night I felt hands on my shoulders when I was alone. God forgive me for what I've captured. Sarah's phone rang, startling her. It was Marcus. I found death certificates, he said without greeting, for William and Catherine Beckford. Both died in Massachusetts in December 1858, just weeks after leaving San Francisco. Cause of death listed as unknown fever. They were buried in the family plot. Both children died? Sarah asked, staring at Carlton's disturbing letter. Yes, but here's the strange part. There are newspaper accounts of local children claiming to see William and Catherine playing in the gardens of the Massachusetts house months after their reported deaths. The same reports mention handprints appearing on walls and windows. Sarah was about to respond when she noticed something on the table before her, moisture forming on the polished wood surface. As she watched, it took the distinct shape of a small handprint, then another beside it. She dropped her phone and backed away. The prints evaporated within seconds, leaving no trace. When she retrieved her phone with trembling hands, Marcus was still talking, and I found a note that Elizabeth Beckford insisted the children's hands be bound before burial. Isn't that the strangest? Marcus, Sarah interrupted, her voice barely steady, I need you to help me find out what happened in that Beckford house. I think we've disturbed something by bringing their photograph into the light. Outside the archive window, fog rolled in from the bay, unusually thick for midday. Within its swirling depths, Sarah could almost make out small figures running, playing, or perhaps fleeing from something she couldn't quite see. The original Beckford mansion was demolished in 1906 after the earthquake, Marcus explained, as they drove through the foggy streets of Nob Hill. But according to records, it stood right here. They parked beside an upscale apartment building with a classically inspired facade. Nothing remained of the original structure, yet Sarah felt drawn to the location. The neighborhood had transformed completely over the decades, from the exclusive enclave of gold rush millionaires to earthquake rubble, then rebuilt into the luxury district it remained today. What exactly are we looking for? Marcus asked, as they stood on the sidewalk staring up at the building. I don't know, Sarah admitted. A connection. Something that might explain what we're seeing in that photograph. They approached the building's entrance, where an elderly doorman greeted them with polite curiosity. We're from the Historical Society, Sarah explained, showing her credentials. Researching the history of this site. The doorman, whose name tag read Walter, nodded thoughtfully. The Beckford place, right? There's still a cornerstone from the original foundation in the basement. Management keeps talking about creating a little historical display, but it never happens. Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. Would it be possible to see it? Marcus asked. Walter hesitated, then shrugged. Why not? Nobody ever goes down there anyway. Too creepy for most folks. The basement was cool and dimly lit, renovated into storage units for residents. Walter led them past rows of cage-like compartments to the far corner where the building's original foundation remained partially exposed. Here it is, he said, pointing to a massive cornerstone with faded lettering, Beckford, 1852. Sarah approached it, feeling an inexplicable heaviness in the air. Has anyone ever reported anything unusual down here? Walter's expression shifted. You mean the children? Sarah's heart skipped. What children? Just stories, ma'am. Been working here 20 years. Maintenance guys say they hear children running sometimes. See handprints on the walls. Management had the place blessed twice, but... He shrugged. Old buildings have old stories. While they talked, Marcus had been examining the cornerstone more closely. Sarah, look at this. Barely visible along the edge of the stone were small carvings, childish drawings of stick figures, a house, and what appeared to be elongated hands reaching toward the figures. Kids probably did that recently, Walter suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah ran her fingers over the etchings. The stones too hard. These would take significant time to carve. She looked up at Walter. Has anyone ever researched what happened to the Beckford family? Walter shifted uncomfortably. There was a writer about 10 years back. Wanted to do a book on haunted San Francisco. She spent a lot of time here. Went through old records. Then one day she just stopped coming, left all her research behind. Do you know what happened to her? Marcus asked. Nervous breakdown, I heard. Her assistant came to collect her things, said she kept seeing hands coming out of her walls at home, claimed the Beckford children were following her. Sarah felt a chill run through her. And the research? Where is it now? Storage room upstairs. Management never knew what to do with it. 30 minutes later, they were surrounded by boxes of notes, newspaper clippings, and photocopied documents. The abandoned work of Eliza Montgomery, the writer who had investigated the Beckford story a decade earlier. Listen to this, Marcus said, reading from Montgomery's journal. Jonathan Beckford made his fortune not just in shipping and banking, but by foreclosing on properties during financial panics. He was known for evicting entire families, even in winter. One account describes a mother and 2 children who froze to death after Beckford seized their home in 1857. Sarah was examining a map of the original mansion. The children's bedroom was right above where we're standing now. As if in response to her words, the lights flickered briefly. Sarah glanced up, then froze. In the corner of the room, just for a moment, she thought she saw 2 small figures watching them. When she blinked, they were gone. I think I understand now, she said quietly. Why the hands appear in that photograph. Why they followed the family to Massachusetts. Why they might be following us now. Marcus looked up, his face pale. You don't actually believe. I believe something terrible happened in the Beckford house, Sarah said. Something involving those children and whoever those hands belonged to. And I think bringing that photograph into the light has awakened whatever has been sleeping here for over 160 years. As they gathered Montgomery's research to take back to the museum, neither noticed the small, wet footprints that appeared briefly on the concrete floor behind them, nor the handprints that formed, one by one, along the wall as they walked away. I know this sounds crazy, Sarah said, pacing her office the next morning, but I've been a historian for 12 years, and I've never encountered anything I couldn't explain rationally. Until now. Across from her sat Rosalind Watts, an elderly woman with silver hair and penetrating dark eyes. Officially, Rosalind consulted for the museum on cultural artifacts connected to spiritual practices. Unofficially, she was known in certain circles as a medium with an uncanny ability to sense the history attached to objects. Nothing sounds crazy to me anymore, dear, Rosalind replied, her voice gentle but firm. Where is this photograph now? Sarah pointed to the locked cabinet across the room. I secured it in an archival box after what happened yesterday. After returning from the Beckford site, Sarah had been working late when every computer in the office turned on simultaneously, each screen displaying the same image, the Beckford children, but with their eyes scratched out. When she checked the original daguerreotype, it remained unchanged, yet her digital scan now showed the same disturbing alteration. Rosalind nodded thoughtfully. And you're experiencing phenomena at home as well? Sarah hesitated. She hadn't told anyone about waking at 3 a.m. to find small, wet footprints leading from her bathroom to her bedside, or the childish whispers she'd heard just before dawn. Yes, she admitted. Nothing threatening, but present. Bring me the photograph, Rosalind instructed. But first, tell me everything you've learned about the family. Sarah summarized their discoveries while Marcus brought coffee. The story they'd pieced together was disturbing. Jonathan Beckford, ruthless in business, had apparently been equally cruel at home. Montgomery's research suggested he had confined the children for days as punishment, and there were hints of worse abuses. The household staff had high turnover except for Harold Meyer, who had died the same day as Beckford. "And the children?" Rosalind asked. "What do we know about their deaths?" "Death certificates say fever, but Elizabeth Beckford's letters suggest something else. She wrote to her sister about the walls bleeding and hands reaching for my children in the night. She had William and Catherine's hands bound before burial." Rosalind's expression darkened. "Bring me the photograph now." With gloves, Sarah carefully removed the daguerreotype from its protective box and placed it before Rosalind, who didn't touch it but leaned close, studying it intently. "There were 3 children," she said suddenly. Sarah blinked in confusion. "The records only mention William and Catherine." "Nevertheless, there were 3. The third died before this photograph was taken." Rosalind pointed to a seemingly empty space beside the seated children. "She stands here in spirit. Her name was Mary." A cold draft swept through the office, rustling papers. "The hands in the photograph," Rosalind continued, "belonged to Harold Meyer. He was trying to protect them." "Protect them from what?" Marcus asked, his skepticism evident despite the unease on his face. "From their father," Rosalind stated flatly. "Jonathan Beckford killed his youngest daughter in a rage. Harold helped the other children hide her body in the walls of the house to prevent them from meeting the same fate. The children's mother was too afraid to intervene." Sarah felt ill. "Are you saying Beckford's fall was no accident? The children pushed him. Harold helped them cover it up, but then took his own life out of guilt. The children tried to tell their mother what had happened, but she refused to believe them. She took them away, but it was too late. Mary's spirit had attached itself to her siblings. She followed them to Massachusetts, still reaching for them, still trying to emerge from the walls where she'd been hidden." As Rosalind spoke, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Sarah noticed condensation forming on her coffee mug, tiny fingerprints appearing in the moisture. "The photographer saw it through his lens," Rosalind continued. "The camera captured what the human eye missed. Mary's hands, reaching from the other side. Harold's hands, still trying to protect the children. The images drove him to madness, just as they did the writer who investigated decades later." "What do they want from us?" Sarah whispered. Rosalind finally touched the photograph, then withdrew her hand as if burned. "Justice, recognition. Mary Beckford was erased from history, her existence denied. The truth about the family buried. When you brought this photograph into the light, you opened a door." As if confirming her words, the lights flickered. Sarah's computer screen came to life, displaying a single Word document with text appearing letter by letter, "Find me." "We have to locate Mary's remains," Sarah realized. "They must still be in the foundation of the original house." Rosalind nodded gravely. "Until you do, I'm afraid the phenomena will only intensify. The children have waited over 160 years to tell their story. They won't be silenced again." On the wall behind them, visible only for a moment before fading away, 3 sets of small handprints appeared side by side, a silent affirmation of Rosalind's chilling conclusion. The property management company required considerable persuasion, and eventually the intervention of a city council member interested in historical preservation before granting permission to examine the Beckford building's foundation. 3 days later, Sarah, Marcus, and a small team from the Historical Society stood in the basement with ground-penetrating radar equipment. "We're looking for anomalies in the original foundation walls," Sarah explained to the technician, a graduate student named Amir who specialized in archaeological surveys. "Specifically, any cavity that might be large enough to contain human remains." "You really think there's a body in these walls?" Amir asked, adjusting his equipment. "After all this time?" "Historical records suggest it's a possibility," Sarah replied carefully, having decided against sharing their more supernatural experiences. "The original foundation is largely intact beneath the newer construction." They worked methodically, scanning sections of the old stone foundation that remained exposed. For 2 hours, they found nothing unusual, until they reached the northeast corner, where the children's bedrooms would have been located in the original house. "I'm getting something here," Amir said, frowning at his monitor. There's definitely a void space behind this section, roughly 2 feet by 3 feet. Sarah approached the wall, which appeared solid and unremarkable. Can we determine what's inside the void? Not without opening it up, Amir replied, but it's not part of the original construction plan. This was added later. See how the stonework pattern changes slightly? The building manager, who had been watching nervously, stepped forward. Hold on, you can't just start tearing up the foundation of an occupied building. We'll need proper permits, Marcus agreed, and an archaeologist present. Sarah was about to respond when she noticed something on the wall, a faint discoloration seeping through the stone in 3 parallel lines, like fingers dragging downward. As they watched, the discoloration darkened, taking on a rusty hue. Is that blood? The manager asked, backing away. It's rust from old pipes, Marcus said quickly, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Sarah approached the wall, compelled by an instinct she couldn't explain. When she placed her hand against the stone, it felt unnaturally cold. We need to open this wall today, she said firmly. Whatever is happening here is accelerating. The manager began to protest, but was interrupted by a sudden, sharp sound, like fingernails scratching against stone, coming from inside the wall. Everyone fell silent. I'll call for an emergency permit, the manager said, his face pale as he hurried from the basement. 4 hours later, as evening fell over San Francisco, a structural engineer had carefully removed several stones from the foundation wall, revealing a small, dark cavity. The musty air that escaped carried the unmistakable scent of decay. Sarah stood transfixed as the engineer shone a light into the opening. There, nestled in the narrow space, were the unmistakable remains of a child, small bones wrapped in the deteriorated fabric of what had once been a dress, a tarnished locket still clasped around the tiny neck bones. My God, Marcus whispered. You were right. The city police were called, the area cordoned off as a potential crime scene despite the age of the remains. Sarah provided a statement about their historical research, carefully omitting the supernatural elements that had led them to this discovery. As the forensics team worked to carefully remove the remains, Sarah stood apart from the others, overwhelmed by the reality of what they had found. The historian in her had suspected, but the human in her had hoped they were wrong. We found her, Mary, she whispered, too quiet for anyone else to hear. You can rest now. That night, Sarah returned to her apartment exhausted. The preliminary examination had confirmed the remains were those of a female child, approximately 5 years old, dead for well over a century. DNA testing would be performed, though matching it to any living Beckford descendants would be challenging. As she prepared for bed, Sarah noticed the house seemed different, quieter. The oppressive atmosphere that had followed her from the museum lifted. No mysterious handprints appeared on her bathroom mirror as she brushed her teeth. No childish whispers disturbed the silence. She was almost asleep when her phone chimed with a text from Marcus. You need to see this. Attached was a photo of the daguerreotype they had found days earlier. The mysterious hands that had appeared behind the Beckford children were gone. Instead, a third child, a small girl in a white dress, now stood clearly visible beside them, her face solemn but at peace. Sarah stared at the image, her rational mind struggling to comprehend what her eyes were seeing. The photograph had physically changed, the silver plate somehow rearranging itself to reveal what had been hidden for over 160 years. Mary Beckford, she whispered to the empty room. You're real now. You exist in the historical record. As she drifted to sleep, Sarah could have sworn she heard a child's voice whisper, "Thank you." But perhaps it was just the wind outside her window, or her mind finally releasing the tension of the past few days. Either way, for the first time since discovering the photograph, Sarah slept peacefully through the night, undisturbed by dreams of reaching hands or children trapped within walls. The locket recovered from Mary Beckford's remains arrived at the museum's conservation lab the following week, after the police had documented and released it as historical evidence rather than part of a criminal investigation. Time had not been kind to the silver piece. Tarnish had nearly blackened its surface, and the delicate clasp mechanism had fused shut with corrosion. "We'll need to be extremely careful," Elena said as she prepared specialized solutions for cleaning. "The metal is fragile, and whatever might be inside, a photograph, a lock of hair, could disintegrate upon exposure to air." Sarah watched the painstaking process with barely contained impatience. The locket represented their best chance at confirming the identity of the remains and potentially revealing more about the family's secrets. The forensic anthropologist estimated the child was between 5 and 6 years old, she told Elena, consistent with a third Beckford child who would have been younger than Catherine. "But still no official record of her existence?" Elena asked, gently applying a solution to dissolve the corrosion around the locket's seam. "Nothing definitive. Birth records from that period are incomplete, especially for children who died young." Sarah sighed. It wasn't uncommon for families to essentially erase a deceased child, particularly if the circumstances were problematic. After 2 hours of delicate work, Eleanor finally managed to separate the two halves of the locket. Inside was a small, faded photograph on one side, barely discernible as a family portrait, and on the other, something unexpected. A folded piece of paper, preserved within the sealed silver case. With trembling hands, Elena used micro-tools to carefully unfold the brittle paper. The handwriting was small and rushed, the ink faded but legible. "May God forgive what I could not prevent. Mary Elizabeth Beckford, beloved daughter, born May 3, 1852, taken by her father's hand October 17, 1857. Her siblings know the truth. I have helped conceal her body at their request to protect them from suffering the same fate. The master's fall was no accident. May the children find peace that eluded them in this house of horrors. Harold Meyer." Sarah read the confession twice, her heart pounding. He left evidence. He wanted the truth to be found eventually. "This changes the historical record of the entire family," Eleanor said quietly. "Jonathan Beckford wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was a murderer. And the children were victims who finally fought back," Sarah added. "No wonder Elizabeth fled with them after Jonathan's death. She must have suspected what had happened." The museum director was called in, followed by representatives from the police department. The confession, while over 160 years old, was still evidence of multiple deaths that had never been properly investigated. Later that afternoon, Sarah sat in her office with Marcus, both processing the implications of their discovery. "The Historical Society wants to create a special exhibition," Marcus said. "The Beckford Family, Tragedy and Secrets in Gold Rush, San Francisco. They're talking about featuring the daguerreotype prominently." Sarah hesitated. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Why not? This is the historical discovery of your career. The photograph that started it all should be the centerpiece." "The photograph has changed," Sarah reminded him. "How do we explain that? Beyond that, I'm not comfortable using these children's tragedy as a museum attraction." Before Marcus could respond, Sarah's computer chimed with an email notification. It was from a genealogist they had contacted about tracing the Beckford family line. "Listen to this," she said, scanning the message. "Both Beckford children, William and Catherine, died within months of arriving in Massachusetts. Elizabeth remarried a year later but had no more children. The family line ended there. So there are no living descendants? None that carry the Beckford name or direct bloodline." Sarah looked up. "The Beckford collection that was donated to us came from descendants of Elizabeth's second husband, who inherited her possessions after her death." Marcus frowned. "If William and Catherine died so soon after leaving San Francisco—" "Exactly. Whatever followed them from that house, Mary's spirit reaching through the walls, it never let them go." Sarah shivered despite the warmth of her office. They escaped their father, only to be haunted to death by their sister. Or maybe they couldn't live with what they'd done, Marcus suggested quietly. Children forced to commit murder to save themselves. Sarah turned back to her computer, opening the file with the changed daguerreotype. The three children now stood together, a family united in the image, if not in life. The mysterious hands were gone, the composition now appearing completely normal, except for the fact that it had physically transformed before their eyes. "I don't think we should display this," she said firmly. "Whatever brought Mary back into the light, whatever let her story be told, it's done now. The confession has been found. Her remains will receive a proper burial. The historical record has been corrected." "And the paranormal aspects?" Marcus asked. "The changing photograph, the handprints, are we just going to ignore all that?" Sarah considered his question. As a historian, her professional reputation would suffer if she included supernatural elements in her academic report. Yet as someone who had experienced these events firsthand, the truth seemed more important than convention. "In my official findings, I'll state that we were led to investigate the foundation based on discrepancies in historical records and anomalies in the photograph." "That's not untrue." She closed her laptop. "But between us and Rosalind and Elena, we'll know what really happened. Some truths aren't meant for public consumption, at least not yet." As if in agreement, the lights in her office flickered once, briefly, then stabilized. Sarah smiled faintly, somehow certain that this was not a warning but a farewell. Fog clung to the hillsides of Colma, the city of souls, just south of San Francisco, where the dead outnumbered the living by 1,000 to 1. Nearly every cemetery from San Francisco had been relocated here in the early 1900s, making it the final resting place for generations of Bay Area residents. Sarah stood beside the small coffin, appropriately sized for a child's remains, as the priest completed the burial service. The Historical Society had arranged for Mary Beckford to be interred in the historic section of Cypress Lawn Cemetery, near other Gold Rush-era graves. A simple headstone marked the spot. Mary Elizabeth Beckford, May 3rd, 1852, October 17th, 1857, forgotten no more. The ceremony was sparsely attended, just Sarah, Marcus, Eleanor, and Rosalind, along with a few representatives from the Historical Society and city officials. No family remained to mourn a child who had died over 160 years ago, whose existence had been deliberately erased from record. "Do you think she's at peace now?" Marcus asked quietly as they watched the cemetery workers begin to fill the grave. "I hope so," Sarah replied. "Her story has been acknowledged, her remains given proper respect, her name carved in stone." Rosalind stepped forward, placing a small bouquet of white roses on the coffin before the first shovelful of earth fell upon it. "The dead don't always want vengeance," she said. "Sometimes they just want to be remembered." The fog seemed to thicken around them as the burial concluded, swirling in patterns that almost resembled dancing figures. Sarah felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since discovering the daguerreotype, as if a weight had lifted from her shoulders. Back at the museum, the Beckford collection had been fully catalogued, including the daguerreotype with its inexplicable alteration. The official report noted that, upon closer examination, the photograph revealed 3 children rather than 2, leading researchers to investigate family records more thoroughly. No mention was made of phantom hands or changing images. Harold Meyer's confession had created significant interest in academic circles. Historians were already re-examining Jonathan Beckford's business practices and the social dynamics of wealthy San Francisco families during the Gold Rush era. What had once been dismissed as Gothic ghost stories, children's whispers in empty rooms, handprints appearing on walls, were being re-evaluated as potential cultural responses to hidden domestic traumas. Sarah had declined several interview requests from paranormal investigation programs. Instead, she focused on the historical implications, publishing a paper titled "Silenced Voices," child mortality and family secrets in Victorian San Francisco. The supernatural elements remained private, known only to those who had experienced them firsthand. That evening, Sarah worked late in her office, finalizing the text for a small exhibition about the Beckford family that would open the following month. She had insisted that it focus on the historical significance rather than sensationalizing the tragedy. The daguerreotype would be displayed, but only as one artifact among many, with no special attention drawn to its mysterious transformation. As she prepared to leave, Sarah noticed something on her desk, a small childish drawing that hadn't been there before. 3 stick figures held hands beneath a smiling sun, with the words, "Thank you," scrawled in uneven letters across the bottom. Sarah smiled, carefully placing the drawing in her bag. Some historians might dismiss such occurrences as hoaxes or delusions, but she knew better. History wasn't just about documents and artifacts, it was about human experiences, including those that defied easy explanation. Outside, the fog had lifted, revealing a clear night sky over San Francisco. For the first time since this strange journey began, Sarah felt a sense of completion, as if a historical wrong had finally been set right. As she walked to her car, she glanced back at the museum's Victorian facade. For just a moment, she thought she saw 3 small figures in one of the upper windows, 2 older children flanking a younger one. They seemed to wave before dissolving into the darkness behind the glass. Sarah waved back, unafraid. Some hauntings, she had learned, were not about terror, but about truth. 6 weeks after Mary Beckford's burial, the exhibition titled Hidden Histories, the Beckford Family and Gold Rush Society, opened at the San Francisco Historical Society Museum. Despite Sarah's insistence on scholarly restraint, public interest had surged following media coverage of the discovery of child remains in the foundation of a Nob Hill building. "We've had to implement timed entry," Marcus told her, as they walked through the exhibition space before opening hours. "Tickets for the first month sold out in 2 days." Sarah nodded, surveying the carefully arranged displays with professional pride mixed with personal unease. The exhibition told the story chronologically: Jonathan Beckford's rise in business, the family's social position, the discovery of Mary's remains, and the subsequent reassessment of historical accounts. The infamous daguerreotype sat in a specially designed case with controlled lighting, showing all 3 children clearly. "Has anyone commented on the change in the photograph?" Sarah asked quietly, though they were alone in the gallery. Marcus shook his head. "Only Elena, Rosalind, and the 2 of us know it used to look different. To everyone else it's always shown 3 children." "And the hands?" "No sign of them in any version now, digital or original." Sarah approached the display case, studying the children's solemn faces. William, the oldest, stood protectively beside his sisters. Catherine, in the middle, stared directly at the camera with an intensity that seemed to transcend time. And Mary, the youngest, finally visible, her small hand clasped in her sister's. "We've had an interesting development," Marcus said, checking his phone. "A researcher at Berkeley found references to a Mary Beckford in Jonathan's business correspondence from 1857. He mentioned her illness several times, then abruptly stopped. The letters were catalogued decades ago, but never digitized." "So there is documentary evidence she existed," Sarah mused. "It was just overlooked." "History is full of overlooked details," Marcus replied. "Especially when it comes to children, servants, women, anyone without power." The exhibition included a section on Harold Meyer, presenting him not as a murderer's accomplice, but as a household employee who tried to protect vulnerable children in the limited ways available to him. His confession was displayed prominently, alongside information about domestic service in the 1850s and the precarious position of staff in wealthy households. Most powerful was the final room, which contextualized the Beckford tragedy within the broader patterns of the era. child mortality, domestic violence, and the culture of silence surrounding family matters. Visitors would exit past a wall bearing the names of children who had died in San Francisco during the gold rush years, thousands of them listed in simple text that stretched from floor to ceiling. "You've created something meaningful here," Marcus said, squeezing Sarah's shoulder. "Not sensational, but truthful." "Truth is what they wanted," Sarah replied softly. "Mary, William, Catherine, they just wanted someone to acknowledge what happened." The exhibition was an immediate success, drawing record crowds and critical acclaim for its sensitive handling of difficult historical material. Academics praised its scholarly rigor, while visitors were moved by the human story at its center. Sarah gave occasional guided tours, but mostly returned to her regular curatorial duties. The supernatural occurrences had ceased entirely since Mary's burial. No more mysterious handprints, no whispers in empty rooms, no children glimpsed in reflections. Until one evening, 3 months after the exhibition opened, when Sarah was working late again. She had just turned off her office light when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of children laughing, echoing from the direction of the exhibition hall. Following the sound, she found the gallery door ajar, though security should have locked it hours ago. Inside, the exhibition was bathed in the dim glow of security lighting. Sarah moved cautiously through the displays until she reached the daguerreotype. There she stopped, frozen in place. The image had changed again. The 3 children were still present, but now they were smiling. A dramatic departure from the solemn expressions typical of Victorian photography. Mary, the youngest, beamed with particular brightness, as if finally happy to be acknowledged alongside her siblings. As Sarah stared at the transformed image, the temperature dropped noticeably. She turned, somehow knowing what she would see. 3 children stood by the exit door, not transparent or ghostly, but as solid-looking as any living visitors. William, tall and serious despite his smile. Catherine, her hand protectively holding her younger sister's. And Mary, no longer reaching through walls, but standing firmly in the visible world, if only for this moment. William nodded solemnly to Sarah. Catherine offered a small curtsy. Mary simply smiled, raising her hand in farewell. Then they were gone, leaving only a whisper in the air. "Remember us." Sarah stood alone in the darkened gallery, a historian who had encountered the limits of her profession's methodologies. Some truths couldn't be captured in academic papers or museum exhibitions. Some stories existed in the spaces between documented facts. "I will," she promised the empty room. "I'll remember." 1 year later, Sarah sat in her office reviewing the final visitor numbers for the Beckford exhibition, which had closed the previous week. Over 50,000 people had viewed it during its run, making it the most successful special exhibition in the museum's history. More importantly, it had sparked renewed interest in overlooked aspects of San Francisco's past, particularly the experiences of children, domestic workers, and others whose stories rarely made it into official records. The daguerreotype had been placed in specialized storage rather than returning to regular display. Though it had shown no further changes since that night in the gallery, Sarah felt it deserved particular care. After all, it had been the catalyst for everything that followed, both the historical discoveries and the inexplicable experiences that had changed her understanding of her profession. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Eliza Montgomery, the writer who had abandoned her research on the Beckford family a decade earlier after experiencing disturbing phenomena. When news of the exhibition had reached her, she had finally felt ready to confront the subject again. "Thank you for seeing me," Eliza said, settling into the chair across from Sarah. Now in her 50s, she had the weathered look of someone who had faced personal demons and survived. "I've been following your work on the Beckfords with great interest." "I should be thanking you," Sarah replied. "Your research laid the groundwork for everything we discovered." Eliza smiled thinly. "My research and my nervous breakdown." She leaned forward. "You experienced it too, didn't you?" The hands, the children, the feeling of being watched. Sarah hesitated only briefly before nodding. Yes, though for me, it ended when we found Mary's remains and gave her a proper burial. I suspected as much when I read about the discovery. Eliza's shoulders relaxed visibly. For years I thought I was losing my mind. Doctors diagnosed everything from stress to schizophrenia. But you saw it too. It was real. As real as anything in history, Sarah confirmed. Just not the kind of reality our profession is equipped to document. They talked for nearly 2 hours, comparing experiences and filling in gaps in each other's understanding of the Beckford story. Eliza had encountered similar phenomena, handprints appearing on mirrors, children's laughter in empty rooms, a sense of tiny fingers touching her shoulder when she worked late at night. "I'm writing again," Eliza said as their conversation wound down. "Not about the supernatural aspects, I'll leave those private as you did, but about how family tragedies were concealed in Victorian society, how children's voices were silenced, how household staff were often the only witnesses to domestic horrors. I'd like to read it when it's finished," Sarah said sincerely. After Eliza left, Sarah opened her desk drawer and removed the childish drawing that had appeared on her desk the night of Mary's burial. She had framed it, keeping it as a private reminder of an experience that had transformed her understanding of history itself. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "You won't believe this. Another daguerreotype just arrived in a donation. Family photo, 1860s, something odd in the background." Sarah smiled, feeling a familiar flutter of anticipation rather than dread. Not all historical mysteries were dark or threatening. Sometimes the past simply wanted acknowledgement, a voice after long silence, recognition after deliberate erasure. "I'll be right there," she texted back. As she gathered her things, Sarah glanced at the framed drawing once more. History, she had learned, was not just a collection of verifiable facts. It was also whispers that echoed down the years, impressions left on the world by those who had passed through it, truths waiting to be recognized even when the evidence seemed impossible. The Beckford children had found their voice through her. Who knew what other forgotten stories might be waiting in the museum's collections, in foundations of old buildings, or in photographs where inexplicable details lurked just at the edge of perception. Sarah switched off her office light and headed downstairs to meet Marcus. The past was never truly past, not when it remained unresolved, unacknowledged, unheard. And sometimes, just sometimes, it reached out with ghostly hands to those willing to listen.